In terms of getting what he wanted done, I think one of the most effective presidents we've ever had is James K. Polk. James K. Polk wanted to make the United States great. He wanted the United States to become, well, huge, to gain a good, big, lot of territory, and he succeeded. While he was president, Texas became part of the United States. Oregon became part of the United States. California, Arizona, New Mexico, all those became part of the United States. So let's take a look at it. He wanted to make California and New Mexico part of the United States. Remember, this is the manifest destiny. He believed that it's the United States' destiny to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. Well, Mexico was in the way. And so he said, we need to make these part of our country. So he went to Mexico and said, we'll buy it off of you. We'll buy it off of you. But Mexico didn't listen. They didn't even want to talk to the guy. So after Texas becomes part of the United States, right? Remember, Texas had fought a war to become independent, but the United States refused to let them into the U.S. Polk, as soon as he became president, let him in. Sent him, annexed it, which means made part of the United States. And there was some worry that Mexico might try to take it back. So the United States sent the U.S. Army under General Zachary Taylor to defend the Texas-Mexico border in case Mexico tried to take it back. All right? So the funny thing is, when you are looking for a fight, somehow it always seems to find you. All right? If you don't look for a fight, then yeah, nothing really happens. Now, when the United States annexed Texas, made it part of the United States, that made a lot of people in Mexico very, very angry. But Mexico was going through a period of, well, kind of a lot of trouble at this time. The federal government wasn't doing so well. The law and order was kind of breaking down in the northern territories because, well, it was far away from Mexico. And Mexico they were deciding to kind of consolidate, make a strong centralized government, which is kind of the reason why Texas, broke apart and didn't want to be part of Mexico anymore. Now, when Texas became independent, though, here's the problem. Mexico agreed that Texas is independent, but they never really agreed what was the border between Texas and Mexico. Texas believed that the border was the Rio Grande River, and which is, down way far south. Mexico believed that, they also believed that it was the Rio Grande, but what the Texans believed was the Rio Grande, the Mexicans called the Rio Bravo. And what the Mexicans believed was the Rio Grande, Texans calls the Nueces River. And anyway, there's this huge area in between the two rivers that Texas said was part of Texas and Mexico said was part of Mexico. And, well, the United States, when they annexed Mexico, they said, okay, the border is the Rio Grande, and they meant it was the one that's further south. And the United States sent soldiers there to protect it from Mexicans attacking. And Mexico sent soldiers there to protect it from Americans attacking, because as far as Mexico is concerned, they were crossing the river into Mexico. And as a result, whenever you have people pointing guns at each other and threatening to fire, somehow they fire. And American soldiers, crossed over the river. Mexican soldiers crossed over the river. They said, don't you dare cross the river or we'll shoot. And they shot, and 16 Americans were killed. And, well, that was the excuse to go to war. As a result, both sides said, hey, they invaded us. President Polk said, Mexico has invaded our territory, shed American blood on American soil. Mexican President Mariano Paredes saw it differently. A greedy people have thrown ourselves on our territory. The time has come to fight. So like I said, both sides, because you couldn't agree where the border was, both sides felt like they had been invaded. The Americans invaded Mexico. The Mexicans invaded America. And so that was the excuse. And instead of being able to figure it out and decide, well, both sides went to war. Sometimes war happens kind of accidentally, sometimes happens by mistake. Here, it happens because, well, you couldn't agree on what was the border in the territory. We're not going to get into all of the events of the war, but just a few highlights. A few months after declaring war, General Stephen Kearny took about 2,400 soldiers, marched across the desert into New Mexico, captured it without firing a shot. You know, the population at this time was really, really small. There weren't very many Mexican soldiers in this part of Mexico. And so he marched into Santa Fe and captured the shot. Now you might have heard the name Kearny before, and he's if you know Kearny Street in downtown San Francisco, it is named after him, as well as Kearny High School in San Diego, Kearny Mesa in San Diego, all the Kearny, Nebraska, you know, a town there, Fort Kearny. All these are named after him. And in fact, once we start talking about the Mexican-American War, there's a bunch of names that are going to keep popping up that that people remember their name here in San Francisco. Now, at the same time this was happening, a bunch of Americans, led by John C. Fremont, who also has a street named after him in San Francisco, showed up and launched a rebellion against the Mexican rule in California. A bunch of Marines from John Stockton's Pacific ships showed up to the Mexican governor's office and said, "Yeah, our country's at war. You're under arrest." And they captured him. They captured San Francisco. They captured the thing, and they arrested and jailed the Mexican commander of Northern California. They made their own flag showing a grizzly bear, sketched in blackberry juice, and declared California an independent republic, the Bear Flag Republic. Of course, after one day, they formally asked the United States to take California in. So California was an independent country theoretically for one day. There were a few other battles in California, because Stephen Kearny and his soldiers marched across the desert of Arizona. It took about 300 soldiers. They marched across, and was the only Mexican victory of the Mexican-American War. It took place in a place called San Pasqual in San Diego, where 300 American soldiers and the famous explorer Kit Carson took on 150 Californios, which were Mexican citizens of California who decided not to wait for the Mexican army and attack the American soldiers. The Californios only had like spears because, well, they were cowboys basically. They had spears and they attacked the Americans. The Americans tried to shoot back, but then they had realized that all their guns were wet because they had marched through a river, and they couldn't defeat the Californios. The Californios surrounded them and lay siege to them, so much so that they had to eat their horses and mules on a place called Mule Hill, and eventually the Marines from San Diego came and rescued them, and the Californios gave up. That was the only Mexican victory of the Mexican-American War, and it happened in California. Now, while this was going on, the Maine U.S. Army, which again, remember is usually very small, but gets large whenever you need you're fighting a war, invaded Mexico. They set sail and landed in Monterrey, which is right on the coast, and began to move towards Mexico City, which is the capital. Because remember, you capture the capital of the country at war, basically the war's over. Well, in response, General Santa Anna, remember him? Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, was given a command again. After the Alamo, he had become disgraced and lost favor, but now the country is under attack, and so the people turned to him again. And he marched with 20,000 Mexican soldiers. They fought in February 1847 near Buena Vista, and it was pretty fierce fighting. But eventually the Americans prevailed, and Santa Anna had to retreat. A month later, another American army led by General Winfield Scott landed in Veracruz in southern Mexico. Now, this army, over 6 months, would fight their way into Mexico City, which is the capital of Mexico, because, as I said, you capture the capital, you win the war. They captured the capital in September 1847. Along the way, they fought a whole bunch of battles, including the famous Battle of Chapultepec, which Chapultepec was I guess you could call it a castle, a really large building near Mexico City, and it was a military academy, which means a school where you train to become soldiers. As the American army was nearing, the school closed, but they used it as a fort and to fight against the Americans, and the Americans had to fight their way up the hill to attack the castle. Among the defenders were some of the students, as young as 13 years old, and in Mexico, these students are regarded as heroes, and they're part of the Mexican folklore, including apparently one student faced with defeat, he rather than surrender, he took the Mexican flag and wrapped himself in it and jumped off the parapet, jumped off the rail, rather than having to surrender the flag. And now, if historians who later looked at this, they don't think it quite happened that way, but because it was so long ago and there was not so many. It's very hard to prove that it did happen, but that is the legend that has grown up around the Battle of Chapultepec. Well, the Americans captured Mexico City, and while fighting continued sporadically for about a month, the war was basically over, and everybody knew it. In 1848, Mexico and the United States signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war. In the treaty, Mexico gives up Texas. Right? They said, no, we're no longer going to have any claim on Texas or any part of Texas. We're going to let you stay part of the United States. Mexico also gave up a vast region known as the Mexican Secession, about half of the country, which today would be the states of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and part of Colorado. It was all part of Mexico that now belongs to the United States. And we still remember the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo because it's, the basis of where we live today. So that's what the United States got. They got California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, parts of Colorado, and Wyoming. What did Mexico get? Mexico, they got peace, right? They got peace. The war ends. The United States is going to pay $15 million to Mexico. And they promised to protect the 80 to 100,000 Mexicans living in Texas and in the Mexican Secession. According to the treaty, Mexicans who own territory in these places, they are now automatically American citizens. Their property is to be respected, and they're allowed to keep what they own, as long as they can prove that they owned it. All right, so that's going to be really, really super important to remember, that all the people who lived there are now automatically American citizens. So that's where you hear the phrase that some old people used to say, "I never crossed the border." Instead, the border crossed us. And there are still people, especially people who live in San Francisco and Los Angeles, who can trace their ancestry back to those days, that they've been living in California for that long, and that's where they know that they are part of California. All right, so here is a better map of all the Mexican secession of 1848. Secession, when you cede it to someone, you are giving it to them. And although the Mexican didn't really give it to the United States kind of took it, Mexico gave up all their claim to it. So as you can see, from New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. It's the states that now exist. Now notice there's one small part down in the bottom corner. That's mostly part of Arizona. Now that bottom part that is now in Arizona was actually bought by the United States. A guy named James Gadsden went down to buy that part of territory from Mexico. Now Mexico, he paid $10 million for it. The reason he wanted it was so that they could build a railroad through there from, well, Texas all the way to California. Now, Mexico was willing to sell it because, well, you know, it's, if you've ever been to that part of Mexico, it is desert. It's really dry. There's not much there. It's not very valuable, actually. So the Mexico was happy to sell it. Now, most Americans were pleased with the new boundaries of the nation. Many thought that the United States was, you know, we were good people. We're not going to bully or invade our countries. Well, that changed that. Now Americans knew that there's a dark side to Manifest Destiny, that the United States is just as capable of attacking and invading other countries as, well, what we blame Europe for. And not everybody was in favor of the Mexican-American War. There were actually a lot of people who voted against it, including a young congressman named Abraham Lincoln. But, well, this was what the war had happened, and now it was over, and the United States had won and was now from sea to shining sea. So here is 1853, what the map looks like. The area in blue is the United States. The darker blue are what the states are. California becomes a state in 1849. The lighter blue are what we call territories, areas that were part of the United States, owned by the United States, but were not a state like California. The green is Mexico. The boundaries of Mexico have been set. The kind of the brownish orange is Great Britain. It is what today is the country of Canada. Notice that this kind of dark area is owned by Russia. It's what we call Alaska today, and that's going to be important in the future. So now the area that we call the continental United States is complete. It goes from the Atlantic Ocean on the right, expands through Florida, expands through the Louisiana Purchase, expands through Texas, expands through the Mexican Cession, expands through Oregon country, and expands to the Gadsden Purchase. When we say the continental United States, this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about Hawaii and Alaska. Just as in these form what are our 48 states, from sea to shining sea. And the United States got most of it by 1853.